Okay, this is an interview with Jaco Schiller and Sivan Sartin. And it's a collaborative interview on obsessive hegemonic heterosexuality. And we're going to be talking about our experiences with sort of like the male gaze, toxic masculinity, in respect to our heterosexuality. And I think we should start off with, I'll ask you first, like, what's a little bit of your history with heterosexuality from like the first kind of like awakening to your sexuality, so sexuality, not just heterosexuality. And then I think we'll go into some of these prompts that we have.
Yeah. So I can say that I have been a sexual being for as long as I can remember. I've like from a very young age.
Like so young, right?
Yeah, super young. Like probably like 3 years old if I had to like pin like an age, but like I can't really say for sure. Like my memories are foggy then, but like I think that Disney was a huge influence on my sexuality. I remember feeling arousal from like when the prince and the princess would kiss each other. Like I wanted that badly.
Wow.
when I was that young.
Totally.
And I started experimenting when I was pretty young too. Like and we'll probably get into this more just like when we talk more about heterosexuality, but it's interesting that myself and a lot of other of my friends, like in really from like pre-K through grade school, that I was experimenting with, mostly guys, we're still like, we would never have considered like this is gay what we're doing. You know, it's like we're just experimenting together, watching porn together, masturbating together. I first started masturbating and watching porn when I was 9.
Wow. That's
and
young.
Yeah, and with my friends. It was a social thing.
Wow. That's so animal.
Yeah.
In a good way.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
There's like no shame because you just don't know.
Yeah. And yet I was convinced that we were all convinced like we're not gay. Like, you know, like there's no possibility, like, you know. Cuz there is like, you know, when you're young it's like you know, it's like, you know, that's gay, you know, it's you
right.
It has this negative sort of connotation to it where it's like an insult to say that something's gay,
especially back then.
Exactly. Yeah. So yeah, those are like some of my earliest memories. Yeah.
So that's kind of where you're coming from. And now how about like going into college, finishing high school?
Yeah.
Just touch a little bit on like the like bird's eye view of like where you've been, like who you've been with, like how you've experienced sexuality.
So I definitely kind of you know, despite growing up in a very sort of open-minded community when it comes to sexuality and orientation, a lot of my friends were queer in high school. My parents had friends that were gay, and you know, I was always exposed to it to a point where it was natural. It never seemed like something alien to me. But I also very much kind of identified and felt that narrative of heterosexuality that is out of my control to be true for me, where it was like I could never just be friends with a girl. I'm always going to want sex from a girl. Always.
Out of your control.
And yeah, and like I always felt that to be true, not just because it was expected of me as a teenage boy by the societal standards, but I also felt it true in my body. Like it wasn't, I mean, again, it's like, it's impossible to isolate from the environment that we're in and the culture that we're raised in. But there was something reaffirming in myself where I thought, I just knew that was true.
Right.
I'm always going to want sex.
Like you felt that on a body level.
Exactly.
It wasn't just logic.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yep. So, yeah. And again, like I had a lot of, you know, queer friends in high school that were very outgoing with that. And, you know, it's funny actually, even like in middle school, I remember like, parents would separate girls and boys during sleepovers because it's like they assume that, you know, they're gonna fuck and like I don't want my kid getting pregnant, you know. It's like there's always that concern. Which
shit.
is, you know, it was like, wow, okay. But it was so funny because like whenever we would get separated, like we would, like the girls would still hook up. And like that was my first experience with a guy. It was like when I was 13 and like the boys and the girls were separated during a sleepover. And
you were like, you took away the girls? Oh well.
It was like, all right, like, and it was actually
fine by me.
it was pretty funny because it was like I don't know if you want to include this, but it was like the first night of my first relationship with a girl.
Wow.
And that we were, because it was like we kissed that night, and like there was a lot of pressure from our friends, like, so you dating now? So you dating? And it was like, I guess so. And it was 13. Like, and of course, you know, I'm so excited to like call someone my girlfriend at 13. I'm like, this is like a dream come true, you know. But then we're separated for the night, and then I end up hooking up with a guy that night.
That must have been confusing.
It was confusing because I was so not expecting it.
Yeah.
It wasn't. I didn't consider myself even like bi-curious at that time. Like I didn't know. I was just like I had zero experience with girls or boys, you know.
Yeah.
So like I just didn't know. And I was really confused by that. And then, we like hooked up a couple more times after that and it was really good. But there was still like this feeling of like, this is wrong.
Yeah.
Like, and again, not just because of like that prescribed identity that is, you know, the heterosexual male. Like it was a body response from something isn't right here. Something doesn't feel right in my body with this, like towards like the last time we hooked up. I forget if I was able to articulate that to him, but basically we stopped seeing each other and we haven't actually really spoken much since.
So that kind of shame like ended the relationship then.
Yeah. And that kind of was carried on through high school. Like I always felt this detachment from my gay friends because of identifying with that cultural narrative that like this is wrong for me. And like I wanted to experience more gay experiences before I could know that for sure. But I was way too scared to ever make a move. Like if I was going to have any other experience with a man, they would have to make the move on me because I was too scared to initiate anything. So I really didn't, I had no gay experiences in high school, which I regret.
Right.
But yeah, I'm like finally coming to terms with my queerness now in college, and experimenting again. And
how trendy of you.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, that's the thing. That was the other detachment that I felt, that I just didn't trust my friends that were saying that they were gay or they were bi or that they were using they them pronouns. Like I just thought, like, are you really though? Like, is this really
What's
your
the real
identity, or is
you?
this just the trendy thing to do?
Yeah.
And so, you know, that's yeah, that's part of the reason I still am pretty, like, I still use he him pronouns, and I think that's why. Like, and there's a lot of reasons for that, but like one of them being like, I want to represent the male body as I am in my queerness. And also, yeah, it just feels like identity is not something that's fixed for me. And I'm scared of having a preference of orientation or identity because I'm afraid of confinement and expectation then from others based on what I say my orientation is or what my identity is.
Yeah.
So
Being in that box.
Yep. Yeah, but yeah, I've definitely been able to sort of like look past that narrative of that expectation that like a man and a woman will sleep together regardless. It's just what happens.
Yeah.
And yeah, like exploring queerness is like one way to confront that, but that's not the only way. You know, I think that it's kind of tricky for me because every single sexual relationship I've ever had in my life has been with friends, people that I trust. So I think, and also like sex for me has always been a very like passionate, like romantic experience. I don't really understand the hookup culture. I don't understand how people can be so detached when they have sex, or that they can say that they are. Like, I'm not really sure if I believe that it's possible. I know that it's not possible for me. But it's just interesting that, like, our generation has really kind of, has really sort of perpetuated that idea that, like, hookups can happen without that, without emotion or without romance or intimacy. So yeah, I've kind of struggled with that, but yeah, I think that's another way of sort of confronting it, is that intimacy is not one thing, you know, that intimacy can be sexual, can be romantic, can be friendship. That is one of the biggest things, I think, outside of like sexual orientation, that has really been the answer to that question of like, why is that not true? That heterosexuality is just out of our control, that it's nature. Yeah.
Nice. Cool.
Something like that.
Something along those lines.
Yeah.
I don't know. I'll go into my history a little bit.
Please, yeah.
Well, around sex, I had the grace of God the grace of God and fear was instilled in me around sex, heterosexual sex. I was so terrified of getting a girl pregnant that I felt very shameful to be having sexual relations with anyone, with a woman, with a girl. And that shame was really heavy for a long time. Just because, like, from age 12 to like 18, you know, my home environment was this environment in which that was preached, like you're too young to be having sex.
Yep.
Like if you get a girl pregnant, you're on the streets. And I hold nothing against my parents in regards to how they raised or educated me around sex, because it's a really hard thing to talk about. I acknowledge that for a lot of people it's hard to talk about and know how to talk about it with your kids, especially if it's not like a thorough part of like how you spend your time with friends or your social circles. If you're not always thinking about it, it's like, oh, what, now you have to talk about sex? That's awkward. Things can be very awkward. So that shame was there, and that was kind of like all of high school was that shame. And it was kind of contradicted with this expectation where I'm a guy and I'm supposed to be with a girl. Boom, celebrate that. Like everyone sees that as like good. Like that was easy, that was to be expected. You're a guy, you're supposed to be with a girl. And so there's almost like that pride of being with a girl, but then there's still that shame around sex and this anxiety of like, I don't feel comfortable because I'm kind of afraid of this. And I think I didn't know how to say this back then, but I was really afraid of being so naked and exposed and like showing my soft spots.
Yeah.
Physically and emotionally with my partners. That was just really uncomfortable for me, and I didn't really know how to think about that. So there was a lot of anxiety around sex for me through high school and a little bit into college. Before high school, all of my sexual experiences were with boys my age. Like there were quite a few. And from the very beginning, like you said, like from a very young age, like I felt like I had a sex drive. And that, for whatever reason, came out with my boy friends. And that felt so right and then so wrong.
Yeah.
Because even though we're really young, we still had that cultural, that idea in us of like gay equals bad. Yep. And so we were always in denial of anything we were doing being gay, just like you said. Oh, like we would be like really doing like, no doubt, gay stuff. And we would be role playing as girls to like help us feel better about it. When I got a little bit older, age 12 or 13, that role playing kind of transformed into like not so much role playing as much as like joking, as if it were a joke that we were really into each other. Yep. And I was with this guy just before I got into high school, and it was the most romantically, sexually involved relationship I'd ever had up to that point. And it was like, wow, like really, really great, passionate, exploratory, fun, exciting, like, oh my God. And then there was that shame of being gay. And getting into high school, I completely turned the corner, and because I also felt attracted to women, found it easy to just assume that heterosexual side of myself and just go to that side and be like, all right, I'm not gay. See, I like women. I can't be gay because I like women. Right. So that was that. And I really I didn't stop having this fear and anxiety around sex so much until I got into a serious long-term committed relationship with a woman in which we, spent enough time together where I eventually had to be straight up with myself and with her and point out these anxieties and insecurities I have around sex.
Yeah.
And, you know, like, we would have to talk about why do I sometimes start shaking when we're going into some sexual intimacy.
Yeah.
Like, there's this deep anxiety in me that I hadn't paid attention to up until that point. And some anxiety is still there, absolutely. But that kind of personal intimacy, one-on-one with someone is, you know, it kind of goes away with experience and with talking about it. So I think that that's a good history on us and our sexualities. And that's really interesting to take us now into the prompt that I want to start this whole dialogue and exploration with. And I heard this from an older man. He was in the family via a partnership, and a very like man's man. You know, he was all about guns and doing work and drinking whiskey and smoking cigars, you know. And when I was younger, that's the kind of man that I felt I looked up to. And this man said, if a girl and a boy are living together, no matter what, they're gonna end up fucking. And that was a huge statement, like a really strong statement that he just said on the sly. He was just like talking about some co-ed dorms in college or something, and that's what he said. And I was there thinking to myself, holy shit, like I felt after that afraid of my heterosexuality because it felt like it's something that I don't have control over. And so let's talk a bit about that.
Yeah.
Heterosexuality being something we feel like is something we don't have control over. Like, it's maybe compulsive, out of our control, and how that might be dangerous.
Yeah.
In society.
Definitely. I guess, like, the biggest argument for it being out of our control and being compulsive is evolution. That people think that this is our nature to procreate. And yeah, I guess, like, that made sense to me growing up. I was like, yeah, I mean, if men and women don't have that drive, then our species dies. But I think that's a pretty dated way of looking at it, like as an argument for heterosexuality being out of our control. I think that that's a completely different, you know, to talk about evolution, and, you know, that's a whole different conversation, I think. Like, I don't think that can be used as an argument anymore in a time where, you know, that is not the only way to bring a human into the world. And, yeah, we're past that. I think that's what, you know, a lot of, like, sci-fi kind of utopian ideals are where the idea of gender is, like, a lot more fluid, and there is less of this prescribed heterosexuality in our culture. And
it also comes from a time of when more generally accepted was the belief that homosexuality is not natural,
right,
that it's some kind of demonic possession or something mentally wrong with you.
Exactly.
Which thankfully more and more of the world is waking up to now, and realizing that it's a good thing, a natural thing. Yeah. That it's not something we need to change. And I mean, like, I know some men in my life who use that around sexuality and gender, who use the nature argument as their main piece of, like, evidence.
Yep.
It's like,
Yep.
a man and a woman are created in the way they're created for a reason.
Yeah. I really
biblical.
I really like growing weed because in order for bud to be produced for the part that you smoke, you can't have any males. If there's a male and a female, they will cross-pollinate, and basically they'll become hermaphrodites, where they have seed pods and they have flower, but there'll be more seeds than flower. And so you can't actually grow weed if you have to isolate the females. So I kind of think about, like, so there's so many different examples of in nature where you don't need XY, chromosomes to, you don't need a male and a female to prolong life.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that, yeah, we're so past that perspective now. Like, it's not a compelling argument anymore. And yet, like, so many people still believe that because it just makes sense. It, like, the same way it made sense to me when I was a teenager, not just because it made sense, like, logically and scientifically, evolution, but, like, I felt it in my body, like, that I was okay with that expectation. I was very, very sexually active with women in high school. I had a lot of sexual partners, and I think because that was expected of me as a teenage boy, that's what you need to be cool, or whatever. But I also loved it. Like, I felt good. I felt powerful.
Yeah.
But it also was not great. Like, I am not happy with the choices I made at that time, with women sexually. Like, it was so much following that narrative of expectation to be that way.
Yeah.
That it did feel not necessarily forced, but like there would always be a time when I would kind of reflect and be like, there's something wrong with this. Like, and that also had a lot to do with just like my lack of ability to communicate about sex with people.
Yeah.
And yeah.
Yeah. So, like, the culture around us is, what makes us, and we make the culture that we're in.
Yes, exactly.
And so this question comes up of, like, do I have a choice around what my body feels like it likes? Is it even worth, like, trying to extract myself from the culture? Is my desire, is my sexuality something that is learned through culture? I took a class called Men and Masculinity with Todd Morellis like 2.5 years ago, and in that class we talked about sexuality being a learned behavior.
Yeah.
And so it's interesting to go into that and realize if it's learned, then my body, when it feels like something is so right, I just now kind of think, is it really, like you said, like, it can be more fluidic. It's not just one thing. Like, my body liking something doesn't mean that that's the absolute truth. It just means that in that moment I'm attracted to this something.
Yep.
And So is heterosexuality really out of my control? Is it compulsive? Or is that just what I'm told by the culture that I'm in?
Well, I think you're totally right that like the culture makes us and we make the culture. You can't just be doing one of those things. So that does give us some freedom in what we feel attracted to, what our desires are. But at the same time, we can never fully isolate and have purely individualist desires, because we're constantly, and not just affected by, the dominant culture, we're affected by everything that surrounds us, like the people that we're around. And I think that my answer is no. I don't think that that heterosexuality is out of our control. But at the same time, like, I always second guess that whenever I have like an experience with a man and I'm not feeling it. There's something, and I'm like, is this my preference or is this supposed to be my preference?
Yeah. Is this a learned behavior or is this my nature?
Right.
Is there a difference between the two?
Right. And I don't know if we'll ever know the answer to that, because it is this sort of potentially mutualistic relationship, but also potentially competitive relationship. We can just, at some point, we may have the ability to choose if it's mutualistic or not. I think for me, like, finding that mutualism is finding my queer identity, and not bisexual, but queer, because I feel more free and fluid in that identity. Words are symbols that create meaning, and I feel very confined by them most of the time. I mean, even queer is not like, I don't think that's the perfect word, like to emphasize that fluidity. But I definitely think that, language can bring meaning to identity. And at the same time, I'm very scared of that, because I'm afraid of confining myself to an identity when I find a word that feels right. So that's kind of
identity,
an ongoing crisis.
So this really brings us quite nicely to the next question, and that is, are you really queer or are you just a trend follower?
Yes. Oh my God.
Yes.
Right,
Wait, what's your answer?
Both.
Both.
Yeah.
Okay, so tell me about that.
Yeah. So I started out.
And are you ashamed of saying both? Are you ashamed
Not
of
anymore.
being a trend follower?
Not anymore. So I would have been, like, I always tell people, like, if my, like, 12-year-old self saw me now, it would be like, what the fuck happened to you? Like, what? You sell out.
You sell out. Oh, jeez.
Like, because, like,
Okay.
I had this idea in my head that, like, I had to be totally unique. I had to be my own person. I had to be an individual.
Yeah.
Especially, like, as an artist, like, I needed to create, like, completely original work, non-influenced work.
Yeah.
That was completely me and only me. And, like, with music. Like, I would not listen to pop music. I wouldn't do anything mainstream. Like, I thought that the absence of trendiness was individuality, basically.
Yeah.
Or was creativity, or was, whatever word to describe that. But yeah, I'm finding that, like we've said earlier, like, it's impossible to isolate, really.
From the culture around you.
From the culture around you. And especially when it comes to art. Like, we're so inspired by everything. Like, we're constantly inspired by each other. And we can't help it. Like, I'm really, really curious. I'm sure that there have been some studies or experiments done on this, but, like, I'm very curious if you were to, isolate someone for for most of their life, and then ask them to generate creative work and see what it is, and if it is different from what is happening in the social world.
Right.
I would guess that it would still be influenced by human nature. Like, we're just, like, whether or not we're, like, physically connected, like, we're so influenced by everything that already exists.
Yeah. Behaviorally.
Yeah. So, yeah, I think that I've kind of come to terms with that, and again, like, also, like, in the United States and, like, Western culture, there is this notion of independence and individuality, and free will is, like, my free will, like, my freedom to do what I want.
It's yours. You possess it.
And no one can get in my way. And this very, like, individualist mindset that really, it's a huge foundation of toxic masculinity. And there's so many other factors that influence that, like capitalism and, really just possession. This idea that we think we own things, that we think we have ownership or property of something. And it's like, that is, like, in essence what toxic masculinity is. It's like thinking that, like, I am free to do whatever I want. Like, and yeah, I think that's just not, it's such a skewed way of seeing freedom that's very harmful
to a society in which you live.
Exactly.
Because
and to yourself too.
Whatever.
It's like, it's very sadistic almost. Like, it's to think that that we're an individual that's completely disconnected from humanity and, like, and life. It's like, it's very oppressing. Like, and I think, Paulo Freire talks a lot about how the oppressors are oppressed, and that's why they continue to oppress, because they're oppressing themselves. They've lost all sense of humanity. And yeah, I think that the prescribed notion of heterosexuality, of possession, of ownership, all of those play a huge role in that mentality.
And kind of bringing it back to the original prompt, so why look at this? Why is it important to talk about toxic masculinity, the male gaze, both of us identifying as male and being attracted to women? It's pretty much, ingrained in us to have this sense of, I don't know, of the male gaze. Like, it's pretty hard to get away from the image of the male gaze, because it's in all of the advertisement. It's in all, you know, like you walk into the grocery store and what's on the shelves before checkout is like health lifestyle magazine. And it's this image of like this, you know, a woman and her body is sexualized. Like that, like the sexualization of a female body is again and again and again thrown at us. And so where that comes out in our relationships, personal relationships, in our one-on-one interactions with women specifically, is just so important to look at, to have awareness around, you know, like, am I choosing this, or is it something that I am just following? Like you were talking, like, is it possible for me to be just friends with a woman? And a lot of guys would say, no, that's not possible to be just friends with a woman. You know, at some point, no matter what, you're going to end up having sex. But that's just
wanting to.
So not the case. Yeah, it doesn't have to be the case. And like, if you do feel that, it's fine. And you can feel that and not act on it.
Exactly. I think that's where so much of that, like, idea gets, like, misconstrued, is that just because you are, like, want sex,
you feel
doesn't
that desire.
mean that you're gonna act on it
all
the time. Like, that is the expectation, is that you will act on it all the time. But, like, that's just not the case. Like, in terms of the trendiness, it's really funny. There's this great stand-up comedian, Bob the Drag Queen, and she's talking, she's asking, like, the audience, like, are there any straight guys in the audience tonight? And there's kind of this, like, like, really, everyone's kind of quiet. and she's like, you know what, 10 years ago, all you guys would have been like, fuck yeah! Like, yeah! And she's like, now you're like, we're here, I guess. Like,
wow.
It's like, there is,
good
like...
example.
Yeah, like, it's not something we wear with pride the same way that it has been in the past. And I mean, that is like one of my motivations for using he him pronouns, is I want to represent, like, the male body outside of that narrative of prescribed heterosexuality. Because, like, I feel like I'm very interested in, like, you know, trying different pronouns and, you know, finding different ways of articulating my sexual orientation, identity. But I think that I'm always afraid, like, am I just doing that because it's the trendy thing to do? And like, and it's, that's where I judged a lot of my friends that were coming out when I was a teenager. Younger. I was like, are you really though? And like, and that was a big reason I didn't identify as queer until I was much older and came to terms with the fact that, like, just because a bunch of people are doing it, that doesn't mean it's a bad thing. You know, that there's nothing wrong with that sort of behavior, and it's, like, in our nature as humans to do that. So
like the Lone Ranger kind of archetype of being a man, self-sufficient.
Right.
I am my own individual.
Exactly.
I am free from anything. And that's kind of where that shame comes from when you're trying something on that's becoming trendy. And you kind of get caught up in this, you know, the Western patriarchal mindset where if you're not your own man, you're weak. And there's that shame around, like, oh, you're just following a trend, you're a weak individual and you have nothing going for you. But actually, like, culture is us and we make culture, and to participate in culture and trends that come up in culture, I think it's I think it's actually a good thing.
Yeah.
As long as you do it with balance, with like curiosity, with sincerity. I think if you go way, 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 way into like abusing, like if you are just following a trend to get more friends, to get social capital out of the community that is around you, that has a little bit, that points a little bit to like, why are you using this? Like you're just using it, Whereas it's kind of meant for everyone, I think. Yeah. Where everyone should consider it for themselves.
Yeah. Like it's interesting. Like, I feel like we're at a place now in history where it's like, if someone identifies as straight, or it's like, we're very skeptical.
Yeah.
We're like, really? You're probably just suppressing something.
Yeah.
Like, I don't fucking trust you at all. You just like, but,
yeah.
And like like some people like do have preferences that it's like they know in their body, like that this is true for them.
Yeah.
Outside of like the cultural narrative and like, as outside as you can be, But I also think that like we are quick to say that like, are you just doing this for like social following? People, it's making me think of just like how people are saying like, anti-vaxxers are like, oh, you're just like following orders, you're compliant, like you're submissive. There's this like this expectation to be dominant in our society, that like submissive is bad. Don't listen, have your own voice should be louder, than everyone else's. And I think that like we need both, obviously. Like, we shouldn't just be submissive, we shouldn't just be dominant. Not in terms of sex necessarily, but just like in society. But I mean, that's why I think, I recently took a BDSM test and I was like 100% switched. I'm like, yes, that makes sense for me. Cause like, I think that like, that's a really good philosophy or sort of mantra, is that like, it is a balancing game between submissiveness and dominance, where we can find a more sort of, we can really explore without the confines and the barriers that have been constructed by our culture. And I mean, similar with like this idea of like ego death. It's like, no, we can't kill our ego. We need to, the ego doesn't need death, it needs awareness, it needs intention. Yeah, just moving away from the binary perceptions of things that really construct and enforce this patriarchal sort of mentality, that's just so hard to move away from.
Yeah.
Yeah.
This really confirms the idea that there are no ultimate truths about anything.
Yeah.
There are no conclusions. Humans will hop on any bandwagon as long as they feel like they belong to something. We want a sense of belonging.
Exactly.
It can be someone joining, like we've heard stories about why people join a neo-Nazi group. It's because it gave them a sense of belonging.
Yep.
And that was everything to them.
Yep.
And that's one, that's a trend. That's one bandwagon. For us, we're talking about like masculinity is changing in the world. We're becoming more inclusive. Men are becoming more sensitive and aware. I think that is true, and it's coming out in some mainstream culture. And I also know that it's not the case for a lot of people. And I'm not even confident to say that, like, I think that still this is the minority way of thinking about masculinity and heterosexuality.
Especially globally.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And yeah, I just think that's a good like perspective to acknowledge, to have. Because it is easy, like, when we're having these conversations to be like, men are changing,
Right,
you know?
yeah.
And then we go downtown and we're like, oh, these men are still in cowboy boots and wearing guns and preaching about homosexuality being bad.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, like that example I gave of, like, you know, Bob the drag queen, like, you know, I don't think that the men that would, you know, articulate their pride in being straight would be there. You know, it's like we have to think about where we are when
The context.
when we're talking about culture.
Right,
Because it's
right.
like, even if it's just a room that we're in, like, that is a culture in that room.
Definitely.
And, like...
They all came there for a specific thing.
Exactly. So, while I think that is, like, a good example to say how things are changing, potentially, and we should keep in mind, like, that is one space, you know?
Right.
And it's not a state, a country. It's certainly not the world. Like...
Yeah.
So... And it's, I think, like, we can get very caught up in that sort of bubble of what we think culture is with social media, just seeing only the people, you know, who you agree with express themselves. And that can be super problematic, you know, in how we see how things are changing. I mean, look what's happening in Afghanistan right now. Like, it's just like we're going backwards also, while it's like a step forward, 2 steps back is generally how things go in history. I think it's just like we're always kind of like fighting the patriarchy. It's just like this very omnipresent thing that's just everywhere.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's hard to feel like, you know, well, to have awareness of the ways in which patriarchal thinking, patriarchal society, how masculinity, to have awareness of how those things can be bad, is generally, it's a good thing to be aware of. And then it's also like, I have gone down this road of spending too much time focusing on the bad to where I felt ashamed to be a man in a space.
Yep, absolutely.
And I feel ashamed to be a man when I see or hear about a man, you know, talking so disrespectfully and objectifyingly to a woman, hearing about a rape case. Like, those things make me feel ashamed of being a man. Talking about, like, so many problems being born out of patriarchal structures, power dynamics. Like, that shame, like, we need to do something with that shame.
Yeah.
Like, we are here in male bodies, and I just think this is a really good thing to talk about. It's specifically good to talk about heterosexuality, sexual dynamics, because it's such an intimate part of our society, you know, sexual relationships. And it can be hard. Sometimes it's awkward to talk about sex, but it's like, if we can become more comfortable with looking at ourselves and each other and how we, like, think about our relationships, how we think about women walking down the street, if we can talk about that and be like, why is it like this? Like, does it have to be like this? Sometimes I don't like it. Sometimes I do like it. That's really interesting.
Yep.
You know, just talking about this, for me, is what I am doing to kind of relieve myself of that shame of being male, because I've spent so much time feeling ashamed of being male while I'm in majoritively feminine spaces.
Yep.
And I'm at this place in my life now where I'm like, all right, well, I like the body that I have. I know that. So it's time to just really look at everything that makes me up and come to terms with it, look at it for what it is.
Yep.
And so I think maybe to kind of wrap this interview up, we're looking at the male identity, like the typical like hegemonic male identity in the United States, as something that has interwoven into it heterosexuality, as it's not an option. Like it has to be there. And you and I both have said, and we both agree on that, it doesn't have to be there. And that's a very healthy, I think, thing to move forward with. We're giving ourselves choices. We're giving others choices. We are, in ourselves, creating this, you know, reflex. Like if we have the reflex to look at this certain type of body walking down the street, you know, we may have this reflex to look at this body, but then because we're talking about this and we have been spending more time thinking about it, we give ourselves the chance to respond differently instead of just reacting to what our behavior has been. And I think that response, the ability to respond responsibly, like that's the kind of society I want to live in, where we have culture, we have bandwagons, we have trends, we all, you know, follow things, and we can, but we're doing it choosing intentionally how we're doing. We're choosing how we want to respond. We're not just reacting. Yeah.
Yeah. I think for me, one of the big transitions right now that has been really powerful and important to me is accepting my queerness and my being polyamorous, because I always felt that, like, to say that I'm polyamorous, like if I were a teenager, would just be an excuse for not being able to commit. It would be like a way of excusing my toxic masculine behavior of objectifying women and sleeping with tons of women. That, like, to say I was polyamorous is just like an excuse for that behavior. And so I never wanted to say that I was polyamorous or that I was queer, that, like, because I had this fear, you know, as a male body, that I am the oppressor and I am only the oppressor. And yeah, that shame just consuming me, and just maybe this is who I am. Maybe, like, I am the oppressor, and just like I can't escape that narrative. And so finally accepting that I'm not one thing, and that that it's okay to want multiple partners. That has been so liberating for me, because for one, being polyamorous has been one of the best medicines for possessiveness and holding people to totally unrealistic standards of expectation. That you know, in monogamy, it's like, in a monogamous relationship, it's like there are expectations, there are responsibilities that you have, and you have them in a polyamorous relationship too. It's just, you have to talk even more, I think. You have to have even more communication. And to see, like, someone that you're intimate with, that you could be potentially possessive of, to see them having sex with someone else or being intimate with someone else, there's jealousy at first, maybe. There's always going to be some jealousy. That's okay. But there is this moment of transformation that I feel, where I can let go of those expectations that I hold a partner to.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's one of the biggest things in overcoming like the sort of patriarchal, toxic masculine mindset where we own things and we
Ownership,
yeah,
entitlement.
exactly. So that's been a really healthy transformation for me, is sort of coming to terms with that, and not to like hide my masculinity behind queerness or, you know, out of shame, because that's always where I feel like people do that, you know, are changing their pronouns or preferences to hide their masculine tendencies. And maybe that's not the case. Maybe that's just my judgment. But like, I want to identify as male. And because in a feminine presence, you know, I want to reconstruct the narrative of masculinity by being a man.
Yeah. I feel you right there
Yeah.
on that one. I identify with that strongly.
Yeah.
I feel really good about being in a feminine space, showing up as I'm a man.
Yeah.
And you can see by my example that being a man does not mean, you know, objectifying women, of feeling entitled to people's bodies, to objects, to space. I feel like that's a really important work that we are choosing to do on a very colloquial, very social, very amicable level, you know, which is, I think, where it really matters.
Definitely.
The last question I'll ask you is, in your kind of, you know, discovering your intentionality around being more fluid with your identity, your want to rewrite for a better world the narrative of man and masculinity, what does this do for you as an artist? How does it serve you as an artist? How does it apply to you as an artist and a revolutionary?
Yeah. So, you know, it's so interesting that like I still want to identify as a man whilst I also do not agree with binary perceptions that gender, the whole notion of gender is oppressive and labels are oppressive, but they also inform us of how we can transform. That's how I feel about language, you know, that language can be used to liberate or oppress just as easily. And that is one of the big things that I want to think about moving forward as an artist, using language as a writer, as an actor, as a songwriter. How can I take these labels that have been used to sort of create division and create tensions and discrimination, and how can I use language to reconstruct, to reimagine, to move towards a more just world? And yeah, I mean, yeah, being a male artist, that's a huge stigma right there. Like, you know, there's always that assumption that like the male artist is a misogynist, you know, like that's very common in the world of music, and you know that narrative is there and is perpetuated, and So yeah, I really want to stop that. I want to be the example of an artist that is working to combat that narrative instead of perpetuating it. And it's very much more easily said than done, because I'm going to encounter more situations that bring shame as a man throughout my life. And that's where art is going to be really important, I think, to explore that shame, that humility, in a way that can be moving forward instead of just staying locked in this state.
Yeah. It's like we kind of learn so much from seeing our own shame and vulnerabilities. It's like there's so much to be learned, so much that can be learned from seeing what someone else is shameful of.
Yeah.
Especially when talking about manhood or sexuality. Like, wow. I think that's really great. To wrap up, one last thing. If we are to continue this sort of interview series kind of exploration, and we have on the interview a woman, someone who identifies as non-binary, or anything else, if we are to have the opposite gender who has had majoritively heterosexual experiences, who has lived in a majoritively heterosexual culture their whole life, what is a question that you might have for them? Kind of being the other side of this. We started off with, if a girl and a boy if a girl and a boy live together, no matter what, they're gonna end up having sex. Like, you can't say, like, no argue, like, that's just gonna happen no matter what. And the oppression that we feel from that, and the fear and the anxiety that we feel from that, has been evident, has been palpable throughout this interview. So what are your curiosities for the opposite gender, or for someone who is not conforming to any genders?
I think I would want to ask, like, all the same questions that you asked me, because I want to hear
Same response,
their answers.
Explore the same questions.
And I think particularly I want to hear about what to do about it. Like, I think we spend so much time talking about what the problem is, which is important. Like, we do need to discuss that, but there's not enough discussion about what we're doing now. Like, what are we going to do about this?
Yeah. So you're saying, like, you, me, we're sitting across from each other. Let's right now brainstorm on how you and I can communicate better around having a more, like, equal space. Like, taking up equal amount of space. Like, what kind of language do you feel is, like, harmful? What kind of language do we want? Do we like? Things like that.
I did think of a specific question I would want to ask a female-bodied person on this issue. Do you feel that men bear a greater responsibility in solving this issue? Because there's a lot of, like, talk about, like, violence against women, sexism is a women's issue, that it's their problem, they need to fix it. On the flip side, 99% of violence against women is perpetrated by men. This is a men's issue. Men need to fix it. I would say that it's our problem, that we have to work together to, like, we need to have discussions like this.
Yeah.
And we need to
Men,
that
like
it's-
men with men.
right,
Like it's,
exactly. That
Yeah.
it has to be collaborative. It can't just be one solution to this problem.
yeah.
And that it's our issue that we need to solve together.
Right.
It doesn't fall
Men.
on, while at the same time, this is a fact that it is perpetrated mostly by men.
Right.
Toxic masculinity.
Right.
So that's where I'm curious to open the conversation to non-male bodied individuals
Right.
to gain more insight on that.
Do they have a role? Do they need to have a role?
Yeah.
Great. This has been a Creekside interview collaboratively done with Jaco Schiller and Sivan Sartin. Thank you for tuning in.
Thank you so much.